Hi everyone. Today I would like to impart some of my own personal advice for people who are embarking on the study of any system of mythology. Mythology is really big in paganism. Everybody kind of wants a piece of it, really. Polytheists will not only have a broad understanding of the pantheon that they choose to worship, but they will also have understandings of different pantheons. They will have dipped their toes in with different systems from different parts of the world, and many pagans kind of take a great deal of food for thought from mythology. There are many life lessons in there, and it helps us to connect to our ancestors and to the ancient. So, yeah, mythology is really, really big deal in paganism. And I don't consider myself to be any expert in the study of mythology, but I've cracked a few books, and there are a few pantheons that I'm pretty familiar with now. And I do feel that I take a lot of life lessons from mythology. I follow kind of a psycho-spiritual or psychological model when it comes to mythology. So I see it as containing, I see each system as containing many archetypes, many life lessons, and many things that tap us into the idea of the collective unconscious. So the idea that throughout every culture and every time there are various themes and various characters and figures and big issues that have come up over and over again, but just in different cultural guises. So that's kind of where I go with it. I'm not going to talk about how I first got into mythology or the first pantheon that I studied or anything like that, because I'll probably just leave that for another time. But for now, I just kind of wanted to explain some of the advice that I would give to somebody who's either new to studying mythology, doesn't know how to get started, or is starting with a completely different pantheon and is finding it a little bit confusing. Because I think it can be confusing. I think it can be a little bit like wading through treacle in a lot of ways. And it was confusing for me when I first started out, like particularly Indian mythology was really convoluted for me, and a couple of times I almost gave up. It was just so tough. I just couldn't really get certain things into my head. And there's a lot of what appear to be contradictions in mythology and a lot of very abstract ideas that don't seem to meet out in reality, so there's not really any way you can grasp onto them, kind of thing. And there are a lot of gods and goddesses in many pantheons who are other gods and goddesses, or there's a goddess that's actually a goddess in her own right but is also an aspect of another goddess, and it really can get very complex and very conceptual and abstract. So I would say the best way to start really with studying either a new pantheon or beginning your study of mythology with one system in particular is to remember you don't need to go from A to B, and that's something that a lot of people don't really consider when they get their study underway with mythology. The beginning of every system of mythology, obviously, it starts with their particular version of creation or their myth of creation. And if you look at all the different myths of creation that come from different world mythologies, they can all be contrasted and compared, and you can get a lot of meat off the bone with that particular subject. I mean, specifically, there have been many studies about different creation myths and how they pertain to the culture that they came from, and how it proves that these certain civilizations saw the world and such. But we don't really need to start with the myth of creation. In fact, that can be quite a complex place to start. I would say that if you've been drawn to a particular system of mythology or drawn to a specific pantheon for some reason, start with the reason that you were drawn in the first place. So if there was a particular god or goddess that you really favoured or felt that you could bond with, or there was a particular story that maybe you saw somebody make reference to in a film, or just anything that first attracted you to that pantheon, what was the spark that kind of lit up in your mind where you thought, yeah, I really want to go ahead and study that system of mythology? I would begin there. So for me, for example, I think that my interest in Indian mythology was really sparked not only by getting my hands on the Bhagavad Gita and thinking that it was such a fantastic sacred text, but I think also the story about how Parvati first meets Shiva. That story was really inspiring and really romantic to me, and I loved it. So that was where I kind of began my studies. I started with that first central spoke that drew me into that pantheon and that mythological system, and from there I branched out. So I didn't begin with Brahma and the beginning of all things and the creation myth. I actually began with that first place where I felt comfortable and where I felt inspired, and I kind of branched out from there. And that can be really helpful when you're learning mythology, because if you begin with a particular god or goddess, for example, that really attracted you to that system, then you're going to want to know things like who is her mother, who does she marry, what kind of adventures does she have, and then that branches you out as you learn more specifically about, for example, Lakshmi. If that was the goddess you were initially attracted to, as you learn more about her, you actually can't help but branch out to other areas and to kind of put yourself onto other parts of the tree, if you like. It happens organically. So I think that is kind of an important piece of advice to begin with, is that you don't need to go from A to B. You can start it at any point you feel worthy of starting it at. The second piece of advice that I'm going to give, and it sounds really weird, but kids' books and kids' cartoons and kids' resources are really, really good if you're feeling completely overwhelmed by the system of mythology that you're studying, and it seems, as I said, like wading through treacle, like very, very convoluted, very heavy, a lot to take on, and you've got no real way of visualising these gods and goddesses and visualising these places. Sometimes when you're reading mythology, the language doesn't lend itself very well to opening up your visual pathways and to giving you really good meaty visual substance that you're going to remember, because of course learning mythology is all about remembering it. It's all about being able to recall it. It's about being able to relate it to your life. So we need to be able to hold these things in mind, and a lot of the books that I own and a lot of the books that I've read that kind of take you through a system of mythology don't use the kind of language that's emotive and the kind of language that can really get you going and get you thinking about what these different worlds look like, or what the war at the end of it all looks like, kind of thing. Kids' resources are fantastic for that, because not only do they break things down to the very basic content and the very basic information about which specific deities are involved and stuff like that, on top of that they use pictures. So even if you feel a bit stupid kind of looking up a kid's myth on YouTube, or going out and buying children's Hindu mythology for children or whatever, even if you feel weird doing that, it does give you a very good pictorial starting point. It gives you a hand, it gives you a step up. And of course you need to go on to more mature resources, because it's going to be very, very watered down and simplified for children, but it does give you that fresh kind of kick. It gives you a lot of photos and pictures, or it kind of gets your ideas factory moving, which a lot of the more complex adult, steeped in terminology books don't really tend to lend themselves to so much. When you're beginning your study of mythology, don't just read, because it can be very difficult for the information to go in that way. So following on from what I was saying about using kids' resources, I also think it's really good to blog about your study with mythology and your journey with that, or scrap, or use a journal. These things are good ideas, because it kind of enables you to put the notes down in your own way, interpret the myth in your own way, use memory recall, see what you remember after reading a chapter of it, and see what's not quite gone in. These are the kinds of things I think are important. So like you would do at school or university, for example, where you take your own notes and you rewrite and regurgitate for yourself what's been given to you, so it's not quite so formulaic. But that's kind of, you have to be tenacious really to want to learn mythology on that kind of level. And I think for pagans and for witches and polytheists particularly, it does hold that kind of importance. We really do want to get to know these systems for one reason or another. It is of great spiritual significance to us. So I do think it's definitely worthy of a little bit of stationery and a little bit of making it special and making it something that's an event, making it something that's significant as an area of study that you're embarking on, kind of thing. Because in a lot of ways it is a rite of passage. It's a really important thing for us to do, particularly if we're going to incorporate it into our practice, or we're using it to honour our ancestors, to honour sort of our pagan elders and that kind of thing. I think it's something that we can kind of overlook in a lot of ways, maybe. Understanding the structure, I think, is important with mythology. There are many mythopoetic devices and kind of structural devices that come up again and again with systems of mythology. If you begin by just trying to study one system of mythology or one pantheon, it can seem like there is a lot of very disconcerting, hectic madness going on with no real rhyme or reason to it, and with no real beginning or end per se. And you may kind of wonder what the motives of the characters are, or why certain things are taking place. It doesn't really look very linear. It doesn't seem to have much context. It just seems to be chapter after chapter of these things occurring that you could never imagine, with these deities that you can't remember all the names of, and it can get very overwhelming very quickly. But what you need to remember about mythology is that it actually is a musculoskeletal system in a way. Every single system of mythology has a skeleton to it, and that skeleton looks pretty much the same. All systems of mythology, when you break them down and you strip away their cultural guises, and the differences in locations and the differences in the style of the myths and the style of the deities and the characteristics they have, if you strip away that cultural stuff, the same skeleton occurs beneath, and the muscle of character and location and such is kind of built onto the skeleton, but the skeleton will always pretty much be the same. So if you want to learn what the overall mythopoetic devices really are, or what a system of mythology will typically look like in terms of the hero's journey, then I would pick up Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell, which I read earlier this year and which was completely mind-blowing. And there are a lot of different people that write about the socio-political importance of understanding mythology, and a lot of people that advocate more mythology being taught in school and talk about how significant it is for us as human beings. But Joseph Campbell is pretty much going to be the top of anybody's list who reads that kind of stuff. He's very accessible, he's hugely passionate about mythology, and The Hero with a Thousand Faces is basically just an explanation of how all mythopoetic systems work, and how all systems of mythology look when you hold them up to the light and when they don't have those cultural associations attached. So basically he simplifies it. It might not look like he simplifies it because it's a pretty chunky book, and he does do a lot of case studies into different systems, and he gives you examples from many different systems. So it's going to be something rich and enduring that you're going to have to get into, obviously. It's not just a simple step by step, but each chapter pertains to a different part of the hero's journey, and the role of the mother and the father and the sage, and the role of battle in myth and the role of death in myth. And basically every chapter kind of explores a different theme that will come up in every system, no matter from what part of the world or what time it was from. So he basically shows you how all of them follow the same line, and that taps in again to Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, which I very much believe in. Have fun with studying mythology. This is something that I think a lot of people don't remember and find it really difficult to keep reminding themselves of, especially when they are taking it from a very serious and scholarly standpoint, where they are a polytheist, for example, and they are learning about these gods that they hold very, very dear, and this system is very dear to them and very dear to their practice, and they feel that they need to get it right and they need to absorb themselves in it and it needs to permeate. I think often you can get this academic head on that doesn't really encourage having fun with it and treating it as a light-hearted exercise as well. Because if you think about mythology, and if you think about myths that you've read or myths that you know about, they're absolutely chock full of the battiest characters, and the craziest things go on, and a lot of it is quite funny and a lot of it is quite ridiculous. And actually when you strip off the craziness of the different objects and characters and scenes and scenarios that are involved, it's actually quite relatable, really, when you boil it down. And a lot of the deities are funny, and if you imagine them, they're kind of quite funny, or they're endearing, they're charming. And also, if we think of mythology as works of fiction too, I mean, I think we often forget that we are actually looking into a very rich and very complex and awesome book of stories, so it's like reading fairy stories when you were a kid and getting really excited about the myths and legends and the circumstances that were unfolding, getting excited about that, or having adults make stories up for you. We can enjoy mythology in the same way. Just because we've given it this incredibly important spiritual precedence doesn't mean that it can't also be incredibly funny and light-hearted and enjoyable, just as bedtime reading. I think it definitely can be. This is obviously not a video about tarot, which is surprising for me, but if you are into tarot, I would definitely recommend, if you're studying a system of mythology, to try and find an associated tarot deck to help you, because that works wonders. The first deck that I ever used and became kind of used to and started doing readings with was the Mythic Tarot, which is basically completely based on Greek mythology and takes you through the stories of Greek mythology and utilises the deities and the stories to explain the meaning of each card. So I actually have quite a solid grounding in Greek mythology, just literally off the back of the Mythic Tarot. I had no idea about it before. They did not teach any of it in school, or hardly any of it in school. And I didn't have any kind of strong bond to any system of mythology really before that. Then when I was 15 and I started with the Mythic Tarot, 14 or 15, that was what initially sparked my interest in mythology actually. So it allows you to get very involved, because obviously it's pictorial and obviously you're attempting to remember the meanings of the cards, but the fact that you can tap into the way myths lend themselves to the different subjects means that you're going to get to grips with that system of mythology much more quickly. In fact, literally, if you are studying Greek mythology right now, or you're planning on it, and you're having any kind of difficulty whatsoever, I would definitely grab the Mythic Tarot if you're a tarot enthusiast, because the book is very, very rich and it explains a lot. And literally every single card has a different Greek myth attached to it and a different god or goddess attached to it. So it's fantastic for learning Greek mythology. And I would say that, you know, with many different tarot decks for different systems of mythology, definitely it's worth doing. I think it's important to make myth relatable, and this goes back to something I was saying earlier about breaking the very symbolic, very convoluted images and stories down into things that are relatable. For example, with the deities, look at the characteristics of the deity, look at the way they are, the way they dress, the kingdom they rule over, the things they do, the adventures they have, or the things they say and think. And then try and relate those deities to people in your life, or try and relate them to yourself. Try and imagine that this deity is a human being that, you know, kind of walks into a bar and starts talking to you. Try and make things relatable. And say if there's an object in a story that say a deity really, really wants it, or really covets it, or it's like, you know, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Make it relatable by, you know, imagining that it's like a really fancy car, or imagining that it's kind of like an epic wardrobe or whatever. Like, if you see that deity as capricious and fun and into beauty and glamour and harmony and love and light, then imagine that thing she wants as being something that's relatable for somebody that's like that in reality, kind of thing. And I think a lot of books are coming out recently. There's one actually that's just escaped me. I haven't actually read it and I don't own it, but I swear it only came out a couple of years ago, and basically it's this woman who has actually rewritten the myths to make them relatable and contemporary and modern, and to make them kind of tap into modern issues. And you can do that yourself. You don't literally have to sit down and write a book, but you can imagine these things for yourself. You can make the myths more relatable so that you can relate to them and identify with them and bond with them more, kind of thing. And I don't think that this belittles the process or denigrates the process in any way. It just makes it easier for you to really get that meat off the bone, if you see what I mean. So that's definitely something that I would do. And lastly, but not leastly, when it comes to mythology, one of the most important things that we get from learning mythology is the lessons that mythology entails. And you know, when we think about the civilizations that were using these myths and adhering to the messages that were beneath them and placing them into their folklore and placing these gods and goddesses and the adventures they went on into their everyday lives, we think it must be very similar to you know, Christianity and the Bible now. They were using these lessons, they were utilising these stories to hold meaning in their lives and to help them to think about what they should do and how they should behave in their lives. So when you're learning a system of mythology, try not to be just learning it because you're a polytheist and you need to learn it because, you know, your gods and goddesses, that's what they pertain to and are involved in and stuff. Try not to learn it just for that, and try not to learn it just for the sake of learning it. I did that for quite a long time. When I first became interested in mythology, I started feeling that I should have a strong grasp of every pantheon and have a strong basis for every system, because that's what I should do, because of the identity that I place in my spirituality and how I use my spirituality, and because I believe in archetype theory and because I believe in the collective unconscious, I should learn all these systems of mythology. You know, I should have a strong grounding in every single one. But I was missing the point, and I think that's what I'm trying to say. I was missing the point there. The point with mythology is that it is chock full of awesome life lessons, and you can utilise many different resources to get your hands on these lessons if they're not quite clear to you. There are so many good resources in books and online talking about how to break down the myths into the stories that they actually pertain to and the point that they're trying to put across. And again, Joseph Campbell's book is fantastic for this because it actually talks about the hero's journey, which is kind of an amplification of the life journey, basically, in a way, and the different lessons that that life journey entails and how we can take it and identify it with our own lives. Okay, so these are my tips on learning mythology, and please do feel free to utilise them or give your own if you are adept at mythology too and you kind of found your own ways of doing it. And good luck, and love it and relish every minute of it, because it is just such a fantastic area of study, and it will, if you're anything like me, blow your tiny mind.